And now, we come to the point in our story that I'm sure many of you have been waiting for since this series first began. The era of Egyptian history known today as the New Kingdom, and in this episode specifically, the 18th Dynasty. No other period of ancient Egyptian history has been documented in such detail, both by scholars today as well as in ancient times. While I won't be able to cover every topic of interest, I'll do my best to give you a synopsis of some of the key political events, as well as highlights of the lives of the most influential personalities who helped to shape this exciting era in ancient Egyptian history. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The 18th Dynasty of Ancient Egypt. In the last installment of this series, we saw that second Enrei-Tau of the 17th dynasty from Thebes had gone to war with the Hyksos king Apepi, but he was killed in battle. His successor, Ahmose, also went to war with Apepi and had a great deal of success in seizing territory all the way up to the Hyksos capital of Avaris, though he ultimately failed to take the city and died a few months later in Thebes. The throne then passed to his younger brother, Ahmose, who may have been only 10 at the time. Because of this, his influential mother, Amenhotep, is believed to have presided over his kingdom as regent until he was considered fit to rule on his own, which was probably around his 16th birthday. In reality, the 17th and 18th dynasty were really the same family, and so technically they should be the same dynasty. Manetho, though, often separated groups of Egyptian kings into different dynasties with a logic that doesn't always align with our modern definition of the word. For Manetho, the start of a new dynasty of kings did not necessarily have to be due to one royal house replacing another, but could occur when a new phase of Egyptian history started, as we'll soon see was the case with Ahmose. One of the best contemporary military sources with regard to the reigns of the early 18th dynasty kings is the autobiography of Ahmose, son of Ibana, not to be confused with the king Ahmose. A loyal soldier to the new king, Ahmose, son of Ibana, outlines in an inscription on the walls of his tomb his role in the conquest of the Hyksos capital of Avaris and its aftermath. He states,
I followed the sovereign on foot when he rode about on his chariot. When the town of Avaris was besieged, I fought bravely on foot in his majesty's presence. Thereupon I was appointed to the ship rising in Memphis. Then there was fighting on the water in Piedku of Avaris. I made a seizure and carried off a hand. When it was reported to the royal herald, the Gold of Valor award was given to me. Then they fought again in this place. I again made a seizure there and carried off a hand. Then I was given the Gold of Valor once again. Then there was fighting in Egypt to the south of this town, and I carried off a man as a living captive. I went down into the water, for he was captured on the city side, and crossed the water carrying him. When it was reported to the royal herald, I was rewarded with gold once more. Then Avaris was despoiled, and I brought spoil from there. 1 man, 3 women, total 4 persons. His Majesty gave them to me as slaves.
The phrase, making a seizure, means that he killed an enemy soldier, after which the hand of the dead combatant was cut off and brought back to his officers as proof. While later Egyptian kings would attempt to colonize parts of Canaan, on at least this campaign, Ahmose was there to strike terror into the hearts of the local population, punish towns or people suspected of collaborating with the Hyksos, and to pillage the land so that no future army could use it to re-enter Egypt from the east. The expulsion of the Hyksos and the reunification of Egypt ushered in a glorious period that we call the New Kingdom, which, at least according to the most popular chronology used today, started around 1550 BC. A quick note with regard to the dates used in this program and throughout this series. History is not always clear-cut, with historical texts, inscriptions, and evidence obtained from radiocarbon dating often contradicting each other. The reality is, we don't know the exact date when Ahmose died in battle, or when Ahmose defeated the last Hyksos king and took Avaris. Different Egyptologists have various opinions on these and other dates, so keep in mind that 1550 BC and the dates that follow are by no means exact or infallible, but, at least for the moment, they're the best that we have, or at least, currently, the most commonly cited by Egyptologists today. For our purposes here, I'm going to use 1550 to mark the end of the second intermediate period and the start of the New Kingdom. Let's continue. Kicking out the last Hyksos king from Egypt was just the beginning. It wasn't enough to refortify Egypt's traditional borders and go back to the way things were in centuries past. The world had changed, and for the security of his people, Ahmose could no longer allow Egypt to remain the insular kingdom that it had traditionally been for most of its history. The Hyksos interlude had proven that the country was very vulnerable to attacks from the east, and so Ahmose would have to devise and implement a new foreign policy that took this into account, not just for the lands of Canaan and the Levant to the northeast, but also Nubia and the kingdom of Kush to the south. In his autobiography, Ahmose, son of Abana, tells us what happened after the sack of Avaris, as well as about His Majesty's new campaign in Nubia.
Now when His Majesty had slain the nomads of Asia, he sailed south to Nefer to destroy the Nubian bowmen. His Majesty made a great slaughter among them, and I brought spoil from there, 2 living men and 3 hands. Then I was rewarded with gold once again, and 2 female slaves were given to me. His Majesty journeyed north, his heart rejoicing in valor and victory. He had conquered southerners, northerners.
Controlling Nubia was important for 2 reasons. One was for Egyptian security, as during the Second Intermediate Period, Nubian raids into southern Egypt were common and quite destructive. The other was for gold. Nubia's best mines were south of the Second Cataract, and controlling them ensured access to a continued supply of wealth that would be crucial to fund the expansion of Egypt's budding empire. Using the great fortress of Buhin as a base, Ahmose pushed further south to the island of Shat, which was halfway between the Second and Third Cataracts, and smack into the heart of Gold Country. Here, he built a sandstone fortress with walls 15 feet thick and commanding views of the surrounding countryside to help solidify his hold on the region. With Egypt's independence now secure and its borders expanded, Ahmose turned some of his focus to domestic issues. During his reign, a great natural disaster occurred in the form of an unusually violent rainstorm, which is recorded on a monument known as the Tempest Stela. Though badly damaged, some of the text that is still legible tells us the following about this cataclysmic event and Ahmose's response to it.
The gods made the sky come with a tempest of rain. It caused darkness in the western region. The sky was unleashed on the mountains more than the turbulence of the cataract which is at Elephantine. His Majesty set about to strengthen the 2 lands, to cause the water to evacuate, to provide them with silver, with gold, with copper, with oil, with clothing, with all the products they desired. After which His Majesty rested in the palace, life, health, strength. It was then that His Majesty was informed that the funerary concessions had been invaded by the water, that the sepulchral chambers had been damaged, that the structures of funerary enclosures had been undermined, that the pyramids had collapsed. All that had existed had been annihilated. His Majesty then ordered the repair of the chapels, which had fallen in ruins in all the country, restoration of the monuments of the gods, the re-erection of their precincts, the replacement of the sacred objects in the room of appearances, the augmentation of the revenues of the personnel, the restoration of the country to its former state. They carried out everything as the king had ordered it.
One aspect of the 18th dynasty that has intrigued many in the modern age deals with, let's say, their very close family relations. I'm referring specifically to brother-sister marriage. In the case of Ahmose, he was married to his sister, Ahmose III. Not his adopted sister or half-sister, but actual sibling. This, though, may have been nothing new within their immediate family, as it appears that his parents, Sekenenre and his wife Ahotep, were also brother and sister. Interestingly, there's little to no evidence that such a practice was common amongst the people of Egypt. In fact, there's more evidence to indicate that such marriages were repulsive to the average Egyptian. So then, why were such marriages acceptable amongst members of the 17th and 18th dynasties? Egyptologists have given two main explanations. One is that it was an imitation of the gods. For example, Osiris and his sister, Isis, were also husband and wife. As the kings and queens of Egypt were the closest thing to gods and goddesses on earth, such marriages may have been considered acceptable for them. But the second and more practical reason was simply to keep power and wealth within the family. Marriages between siblings ensured that power and wealth would be held within the immediate family and not shared with another house. In fact, preserving his family's power seems to have been a concern for Ahmose. Along with the monarchy, the other great and powerful institution within Egypt was the priesthood, especially of the god Amun, who Ahmose's 17th dynasty ancestors had elevated to the status of their personal patron deity. While Ahmose continued this tradition, he also started a new one, the position of God's wife of Amun, which was the female counterpart to the chief priest of Amun. He gave this brand new position to his own sister and wife, Ahmose Nefertari, which accomplished two things. The first is that it gave Ahmose and his family, including his future descendants, control over the temples of Amun and their vast network of wealthy estates. The second was that it established an even stronger link between the royal family and the cult of Amun, which by this time had become a sort of national religion and increasingly popular amongst the general population, at least in Upper Egypt. Most Egyptologists today are of the opinion that Ahmose died in 1525 BC when he was in his mid-30s. He left his heir, Amenhotep I, a unified and independent country that was now in a position to dominate the peoples and lands that less than 3 decades before had ruled over much of Egypt. Amenhotep was not Ahmose's original heir to the throne, not even his second choice. Amenhotep had 2 elder brothers, but both died before their father. This made him the next in line, but he was too young to rule on his own, and so his powerful and influential mother, Ahmose Nefertari, ruled for several years as regent. When he did assume full responsibility as king of Egypt, Amenhotep continued the policies of his father by expanding the country's borders through military means. He marched his armies further to the northeast than any Egyptian ruler had ever done before, though to what end is uncertain. Other campaigns were launched against the Libyans to the west in order to safeguard the borders of the Delta region and Lower Egypt. However, Amenhotep's primary concern with regard to foreign affairs was to further bring Nubia into Egypt's orbit. Since before the dawn of history, the land of Nubia had been intertwined with Egypt. The relationship was often a commercial one, but sometimes the kings of Egypt would conduct military campaigns into the region in order to protect trade routes or deal with marauders harassing Egypt's southern border. The Egyptians usually had the upper hand, as they were historically the greater power and could wield influence over Nubia's many divided tribes and the few petty kingdoms that had existed in centuries past. However, during the past 2 centuries, Nubian wealth and influence outside of Egypt had grown and was now primarily centered around the Kingdom of Kush, whose seat of power was the city of Kerma, just south of the Nile's third cataract. Feeling pressure from Egyptian expansion to their north, the Kushites launched raids into Egyptian-controlled Nubia with mixed results. In fact, such raids may have only convinced Amenhotep that he needed to personally come south and smash anyone who challenged Egyptian authority. Once again, the career soldier, Ahmose, son of Ibana, who we saw also campaigned with the dynasty's founder, King Ahmose, tells us a bit about his own experiences during Amenhotep's campaign against the Kushites.
Then I conveyed to King Amenhotep the Justified when he sailed south to Kush to enlarge the borders of Egypt. His Majesty smote the Nubian bowmen in the midst of his army. They were carried off in fetters, none missing, the fleeing destroyed as if they had never been. Now I was in the van of our troops, and I fought really well. His Majesty saw my valor. I carried off 2 hands and presented them to His Majesty. Then his people and his cattle were pursued, and I carried off a living captive and presented him to His Majesty.
As far as we know, Amenhotep I was successful in all of his military campaigns, but he's known less for these and more as a great builder. Administrative documents from the time record the reopening and renovation of quarries and mines all over Egypt, Nubia, and the Sinai, several of which hadn't been in use since the days of the Middle Kingdom over 250 years prior. Though seemingly no part of Egypt was neglected, the royal city of Thebes certainly benefited the most from Amenhotep's generosity when it came to temple restoration and palace construction. During the years of the Second Intermediate Period, Thebes had suffered tremendously from the economic isolation that was forced upon the city by its neighbors, both to the north and the south. Not only did trade between the Hyksos in the delta and the Kushites in southern Nubia bypass Thebes, but its inhabitants were also constantly on the defensive as their enemies attacked Theban territory. While things got a bit better during the reigns of the 17th dynasty's rulers, decades of unintended neglect had taken its toll on the city's once great buildings and infrastructure. Now that stability had returned and new revenue from trade, taxes, and Egyptian raids abroad seemed limitless, Amenhotep could rebuild the parts of Egypt that had fallen into disrepair. No site, though, received more attention and funding than the holy precinct known as Ipet-Isut, just outside of Thebes. Rulers from both the 11th and 12th dynasties, themselves both Theban, had already built temples there dedicated to the gods, especially Amun. The name Ipet-Isut means something like the most sacred of places. It's better known today as Karnak. Though considered to have been an important place of worship, the buildings around Karnak were relatively small. However, the architects who constructed the later New Kingdom temples and monuments clearly took inspiration from them, and in some cases created exact replicas of the older structures. For example, a nearly perfect replica of Senusret I's Jubilee Pavilion was constructed during the reign of Amenhotep I, with the only noticeable difference being that Senusret's name was replaced with that of Amenhotep. Other Middle Kingdom buildings were expanded so that their facades eventually became the interior walls of new constructions. While still relatively modest in Amenhotep's day, the future pharaohs of the 18th and 19th dynasties would greatly expand upon the complex by adding larger and more ornate temples to the extent that today, most of the well-known buildings at Karnak date to the New Kingdom era. While Amenhotep I may have sought to emulate the great buildings of his predecessors, there was one type of building, or set of buildings, that he sought to completely do away with: colossal tombs. This might seem strange to some, since Egypt's kings in past centuries, especially during times of great prosperity, generally had built for themselves gigantic, monumental tombs, such as pyramids, as well as large funerary complexes to accompany them. The problem with these, though, was that they were magnets for tomb robbers and looters. Time had proved over the centuries that even the most secure of tombs were eventually violated by thieves, who would not only steal anything of value inside, but often damage the sarcophagus of the mummy and search his remains for gold, jewelry, and gems. In popular Egyptian religion, robbing the contents of the tomb essentially meant that the deceased would not be able to enjoy these things in their afterlife. No matter how revered a person might have been during their lifetime, in death, his or her possessions became fair game. Thus, a giant tomb, or burial pyramid, was a great liability for its occupant. And so, Amenhotep chose not to be buried in a place visible to the public eye, but rather one that was hidden away in the mountains near Thebes. Amenhotep I's mummy, though, was not found in its original tomb, but another one that it was taken to for safekeeping during the reign of Ramesses IX. This is an interesting story in and of itself, but best left for another time. The tomb that Amenhotep's mummy was originally taken from has so far not been confirmed, with many Egyptologists believing that it may have been one of the currently unidentified tombs in the place that we today know as the Valley of the Kings. Other Egyptologists believe Amenhotep's successor, Thutmose I, was the Valley of the Kings' first royal occupant. Regardless, it's clear that Amenhotep I set the trend of splitting the royal funerary complex into two: a mortuary temple, which would act as a public and permanent memorial site for the king, and a separate tomb hidden away from the world, and perhaps more importantly, those who would attempt to rob it. Amenhotep's life and death into the next world seem to both have passed smoothly, but there was a problem when it came to his successor. His sister and great royal wife, Queen Ahmose Meremitmun, or simply Meremitmun, was unable to have a child. Many suspect that this may have been the result of what had been, by now, a few generations of brother-sister marriages within the royal family. The one who ended up succeeding Amenhotep I was a man named Thutmose, the first of his name. His relation to his predecessor is still debated amongst scholars, and while some have speculated that he may have been Amenhotep's son from another wife, others believe that he was a trusted military officer who may have been related to, or formally adopted into the ruling family. Unlike Ahmose and Amenhotep I, Thutmose was not a child when he took the throne, but a full-grown adult who had already amassed a lot of experience in the military. He also seems to have had the support of the now old, but still highly influential Ahmose Nefertari, the wife of Ahmose and the mother of Amenhotep I. These and other factors may have made Thutmose the best candidate to succeed Amenhotep I, who died in 1504 BC. Rebels in Nubia thought otherwise and launched insurrections to test the new king. And so, Thutmose's second year was spent brutally putting down revolts throughout Nubia. But he didn't stop there, and vowed not just to deal with the symptoms, but the disease itself. Since the days of the Middle Kingdom, politically, the Egyptian-Nubian frontier had been roughly between the first and second cataracts. There were times, such as during the reign of Senusret III, that Egyptian armies ventured to the Third Cataract, but these were mainly for punitive raids intended to yield short-term results. What laid beyond the tumultuous Third Cataract was the great city of Kerma, the capital of various Kushite kingdoms throughout the ages. As far as Thutmose was concerned, the Kushite capital of Kerma was the ultimate source of all anti-Egyptian activities in Nubia. Therefore, he sought to annihilate it, once and for all. From the Egyptian base on what's today Sai Island, between the Second and Third Cataracts, Thutmose ordered his men to drag their ships on land to avoid the rough rapids of the Third Cataract and then regroup just outside the city of Kerma. The only sources for what happened next are Egyptian, including Thutmose's own words, which tell of how he and his men desecrated and destroyed Kerma without mercy. The veteran, Ahmose, son of Ibana, who was also in the armies of King Ahmose and Amenhotep, was there, as inscriptions on the walls of his tomb tell us.
Then I conveyed to King Thutmose the Justified, when he sailed south to Kenten-Nefer, to crush rebellion throughout the lands, to repel the intruders from the desert region. I was brave in his presence in the bad water, in the towing of the ship over the cataract. Thereupon I was made crew commander. His Majesty became enraged like a leopard. His Majesty shot, and his first arrow pierced the chest of that foe. Then those enemies turned to flee, helpless. A slaughter was made among them. Their dependents were carried off as living captives. His Majesty journeyed north, all foreign lands in his grasp.
The archaeological remains of Kerma from around the time of Thutmose's campaign also seem to confirm the death and destruction. With Kerma subdued, Thutmose ventured further into Nubia than any Egyptian king ever had before him. However, instead of following the Nile, as one would expect, he took a desert route directly from Kerma and deep into Kushite territory beyond the Nile's Fourth Cataract, and ended up at a large quartz rock that today is known as Hagar el-Merwa. There, Thutmose carved his own inscriptions over those of the locals who deemed the rock to be a holy site. It was now the new southern boundary of the Egyptian Empire. There was no one in Nubia powerful enough to oppose Thutmose, as the Egyptian king made clear in an inscription that he left just outside the shattered city of Kerma.
There is not a single one of them left. The Nubian bowmen have fallen to the slaughter and are laid low throughout their lands. Their entrails drench their valleys. Gore from their mouths pours down in torrents. Carrion eaters swarm down upon them, and the birds carry their trophies away to another place.
Thutmose was brutal, but he ultimately got the result he wanted: a pacified Nubia that was subservient to Egypt. He divided up the conquered territory into 5 districts and appointed governors to each one who answered directly to him. Also under their command were new fortified towns to support the Egyptian garrisons that would now become a permanent presence throughout Kush and Nubia. As for the sons of the rebel Nubian chiefs who had survived, they were forcibly taken to Egypt as hostages, who during their captivity would be indoctrinated in Egyptian customs and political culture. The hope was that when they eventually returned home and became local lords of their respective areas, their familiarity with Egypt and the pharaoh's way of doing things would inspire them to loyally serve the Egyptian crown. The next major military venture was deeper into the Near East. Since the expulsion of the Hyksos, Egyptian policy towards the East had changed. From the time since Egypt's first recorded dynasty, the country's kings were content to formally stay out of the lands beyond the Sinai. While they may have desired many of the exotic goods that came from the east, most didn't seek to directly control or colonize the region. However, the Hyksos incursion into Egypt had proved that disengagement with the east was no longer an option if Egypt wished to be free of foreign rule. While the Hyksos might have been gone, new and more dangerous threats existed the closer one got to the Euphrates River. The greatest of these during Thutmose's time was the Hurrian kingdom of the Mitanni. Despite the name, the Mitanni were less of a single kingdom and more of a confederation of Hurrian-speaking states that were ruled by a chariot-riding elite who spoke an Indo-European language. They were also much more powerful than the Hyksos had ever been. The fear in Egypt was that one day they would cross the Euphrates River and make their way into Egyptian territory. Thutmose struck first. He marched his men further north through the Levant, pummeling any Mitanni-allied opposition, and eventually made it all the way to one of the northern branches of the Euphrates River. As in the past, Ahmose, son of Ibana, was there.
When His Majesty reached Narin, His Majesty found that foe marshalling troops. Then His Majesty made a great slaughter of them. Countless were the living captives which His Majesty brought back from his victories. Now I was in the van of our troops, and His Majesty saw my valor. I brought a chariot, its horse, and him who was on it as a living captive. When they were presented to His Majesty, I was rewarded with gold once again.
This show of force was essentially a warning to the Mitanni king not to cross the Euphrates River and venture further south into Egypt's zone of influence, or else face the dreadful consequences. Thutmose I had ruled Egypt and much of the surrounding territories with an iron fist, and had set up an Egyptian empire that for his son and successor, Thutmose II, extended north to south from the banks of the Euphrates River in Syria to at least the Nile's fourth cataract in modern Sudan. As he states in an inscription,
I made the boundaries of Egypt to the extent of what the sun encircles. I made strong those who were in fear, for I repelled evil from them. I made Egypt superior to every land.
When news of Thutmose I's death in 1492 BC reached that southernmost part of the empire, those Kushite princes who had not been slain during the Egyptian campaign a decade earlier rose up in full rebellion. They were out for revenge, and to an extent, got it. The rebels attacked the fortress towns set up by Thutmose I, slaughtered their garrisons, and forced the Egyptian governors to run for their lives. These victories, though, were short-lived. Thutmose I's successor and namesake, Thutmose II, was swift with his own vengeance, and, like his father, showed no mercy by reportedly putting every Nubian male in the rebellious areas to the sword. Thutmose II was not the son of Thutmose I's great royal wife, Ahmose, with whom he had a daughter named Hatshepsut, but a second wife named Mutnofret. Along with Thutmose II, she bore the king other sons. Mutnofret's lineage is debated amongst scholars, some of whom believe that she may have been a daughter of the dynasty's founder, Ahmose, as well as the sister of King Amenhotep I due to her respected titles of king's daughter and king's sister. Thutmose II would go on to marry his half-sister, Hatshepsut. As a daughter of Thutmose I by his great royal wife, Ahmose, and later becoming the great royal wife of Thutmose II, Hatshepsut was the woman with the highest status in Egypt. Her name also reflects this, as Hatshepsut means foremost of noble women. She also seems to have been the favorite child of her father, and even accompanied him on his military campaigns, including the most brutal ones in Nubia. Had she been born a man, Hatshepsut's status would have clearly superseded that of Thutmose II. But she was not, and though she may have been an influential member of court at Thebes, she was not the king, and ultimately, her thoughts and opinions carried little weight. But when Thutmose II died around 1479 BC, Hatshepsut got her chance to wield considerable power. Thutmose II's heir and successor was Thutmose III, who was a boy at the time of his father's death. He, though, was not a son of Hatshepsut, but rather another woman named Iset. As Iset was not the king's great royal wife, she did not become the regent for her son, a position that ultimately went to Hatshepsut, Thutmose III's stepmother and aunt. As we've seen earlier, royal women in ancient Egypt could hold considerable power and influence, as was the case with Amenhotep and Ahmose Nefertari, who both looked after affairs of state while their respective children came of age. However, the tone set with Hatshepsut's regency was seemingly different, at least in the inscriptions that have since survived. One of them, while recognizing the young Thutmose III as the legitimate king, clearly states that Hatshepsut was the country's de facto ruler.
When he, Thutmose II, died, he joined the gods. His son, Thutmose III, stood in his place as king of the two lands, assuming rulership on the throne of the one who begot him, while his sister, the god's wife Hatshepsut, took charge of the affairs of the country, in that she took care of the two lands. Egypt served her with bowed head, the beneficent seed of the god which came from him.
Everyone at court and in Egypt, though, would have known that regardless of what Hatshepsut's status may have been, she would one day be forced to relinquish whatever power she held to Thutmose III once he was considered old enough to rule. The regency relationship seemed to work as planned in the beginning, but after 7 years, around 1473 BC, Hatshepsut adopted royal names and titles for herself, officially becoming Thutmose III's co-ruler and not regent. Though she at least acknowledged Thutmose III as king and often depicted him on her monuments, he was always positioned clearly behind her to illustrate that she was the co-ruler with more authority. There was a huge problem, though, and it was not that she had just claimed more power for herself. The issue was that she was a woman claiming to be a legitimate ruler of Egypt. While in the past, Egypt had been governed by female rulers, such as Sobeknefru of the 12th dynasty, this had been due to desperate times when there was no male heir left and the country was politically on the verge of collapse. Other powerful women may have also ruled as queen regent for their sons until they came of age. However, no woman had claimed, and in this case practically usurped, the top job in Egypt during times of peace and prosperity. To help her gain wider acceptance, both amongst the nobility as well as the rather conservative general population, Hatshepsut and her followers tried to find ways to neutralize the fact that she was a woman. On one hand, statues, sculptures, and reliefs began to depict her with a more masculine physique and wearing more traditional male clothing, while on the other, she applied female epithets to past male rulers, supposedly to somewhat feminize them so that her own occupation of the throne would seem less unorthodox than it really was. It's probably also during the reign of Hatshepsut that the word Pera, meaning great house, started to come into more widespread use. It's from this term that we get the title Pharaoh. Instead of just referring to a particular great house, Pera began to be applied specifically to the ruler of Egypt, regardless of gender. Today, though, the term pharaoh is commonly used to describe any king or ruler of ancient Egypt. Aesthetic changes and wordplay were all well and good, but to really gain widespread acceptance, Hatshepsut ultimately needed an ideological justification to defend her position as Egypt's legitimate ruler. Here too she made changes, specifically with regard to her family history, which she claimed was not of this world. On the walls of her mortuary temple at the site of Deir el-Bahri, she claimed that she was not really the daughter of Thutmose I, but the god Amun. Other inscriptions on various monuments go in even more detail, such as one found on the base of an obelisk at Karnak, informing posterity that it was none other than Amun who had commanded her to build it.
I have done this with a loving heart for my father Amun, initiated in his secret of the beginning, acquainted with his beneficent might. I did not forget whatever he had ordained. My Majesty knows his divinity. I acted under his command. It was he who led me. I did not plan a work without his doing. It was he who gave directions. I did not sleep because of his temple. I did not stray from what he commanded.
On a more practical and earthly level, Hatshepsut was a good ruler who presided over a prosperous and confident country that was respected by both its allies and enemies abroad. Though there were a few armed conflicts with Egypt's neighbors, military expansion wasn't the focus of her reign. Instead, Hatshepsut launched trade expeditions to faraway lands, the most famous being the land of Punt, whose precise location hasn't been determined, but is believed by many scholars to have been southeast of Egypt, along the coast of the Red Sea near the Gulf of Aden. The raw materials and other sources of wealth acquired from such expeditions were poured into massive construction projects, especially at Karnak. All of this economic and construction activity was going on at the same time that Thutmose III was technically co-ruler. Even when it was obvious that he was of age to assume his birthright as the sole king of Egypt, the throne and real power still resided with Hatshepsut until her presumed death in 1458 BC. Presumed because it hasn't actually been confirmed in any known Egyptian document or inscription when exactly she died, let alone how. Mention of Hatshepsut disappears from the historical record during the 22nd regnal year of Thutmose III, when he assumed full control over Egypt. There's no firm evidence that stepmother and stepson were openly hostile towards one another during Hatshepsut's rule, but as soon as Thutmose III assumed his position as the sole ruler of Egypt in 1458 BC, he systematically had her name chiseled out of the monuments she'd created, as well as smashed images and statues of her, including those at her own funerary temple at Deir el-Bahri, where their broken pieces were deposited in a nearby stone quarry. Future generations of kings also seem to have sought to erase, or at least minimize, her role in Egyptian history, as her name doesn't appear on later king lists. Despite such campaigns to delete her from the historical record, plenty of artifacts have been uncovered with Hatshepsut's name on them, many being obtained from the tombs of those who served during her lifetime. And, strangely enough, over 1,000 years later, Manetho also mentions her, stating that she ruled for 21 years and 9 months. This means that at least in the 4th century BC, when he compiled his history of Egypt, there was some source mentioning her that he was able to refer to. Hatshepsut's accomplishments and influence ultimately made it difficult for her to be completely erased from history. That said, Hatshepsut had her flaws, especially when it came to foreign policy. Her focus on domestic affairs, whether it was commissioning massive building projects in honor of Amun or sending commercial expeditions to the far corners of the known world, did little to pacify the restlessness and resentment of Egypt's subject peoples, whose resources and wealth were financing the empire at their expense. This was especially true to the northeast, in Canaan and the Levant. Hatshepsut's father, Thutmose I, had expanded Egyptian sovereignty to the Euphrates River in northern Syria, effectively keeping the kingdom of the Mitanni in check. However, the 20-plus years that saw Hatshepsut as regent and ruler had done little to solidify her father's gains. In time, the petty kings of Egypt's Canaanite client states saw no reason as to why they should be forced to pay tribute and swear allegiance to an Egyptian ruler in faraway Thebes. The Mitanni kings must have also heard the rumblings of discontent to their southwest, and though they may not have sought a direct engagement with Egypt, it's practically a given that they provided at least some financial and moral support to the discontented Canaanite kings. To make matters worse, Thutmose III was relatively young and untested on the international stage, and, given his stepmother's apparent neglect of Egypt's frontier territories, many must have assumed that he would follow the same course. While Egypt, and to a large extent the kingdom of the Mitanni, were cohesive states that oversaw large swaths of territory, the land of Canaan was mostly a patchwork of petty states whose kings and chieftains were constantly squabbling with each other. Seeing, though, that their best chance to shake off Egypt's yoke and achieve independence would be through a united front, the king of the Canaanite city of Kadesh formed a coalition of like-minded rulers that together controlled around 300 cities and towns within the region. Such organization and preparations must have been going on well into Hatshepsut's reign, for shortly after Thutmose III replaced her as Egypt's ruler, the Canaanite coalition went into full rebellion. Almost overnight, Thutmose III faced several problems. Not only did the rebellion bring an end to large sources of revenue and resources that were either obtained from or passed through Canaan, but it also made Egypt much more vulnerable to an attack from the Mitanni or other group coming from the east. The king of Kadesh and his allies mustered together a large army at the city of Megiddo, which was important because it blocked Egypt's access to the main trade route between Egypt, Anatolia, and Mesopotamia, known today as the Via Maris. Up until then, Thutmose III had not been tested in such a volatile situation. This, though, doesn't mean that he was unprepared. He personally commanded large segments of the army and had gained the respect of his men. He may have even welcomed the Canaanite challenge, for after years of living under Hatshepsut's shadow, Thutmose now had the opportunity to prove himself as a commander and earn his right to be the sole ruler of Egypt. In the spring of 1457 BC, Thutmose assembled a large army at the fortress of Tajaru in the eastern delta, not far from Egypt's border with Canaan. Scholars put the number of soldiers in Thutmose's force at between 10 to 20,000 men. Most of these would have been infantrymen armed with swords, axes, and shields. There would also have been contingents of archers, as well as chariot units. From Tajaru, Thutmose and his men marched for 10 days to Gaza, which, given the size of his army and the supply and logistical challenges that came with it, was extremely impressive. From there, the Egyptians marched another 10 days to the town of Yehem, where Thutmose waited for reports from his scouts about the situation in Megiddo. Along with the army were scribes to document the details of the campaign, a synopsis of which was later inscribed onto the walls of the Temple of Karnak. It's from this account, the first of its kind in history, that we today have a relatively detailed explanation of the war. Of course, it's the Egyptian version of events, but without it, we would know practically nothing about what took place at Megiddo in the spring and summer of 1457 BC. Upon their arrival, Thutmose was presented with 3 possibilities as to how to proceed towards Megiddo. One was through a windy route that led to a plain several kilometers north of the city. Another ran south through the valley of Dothan that ended just southeast of Megiddo near the town of Tanakh. Both of these were considered to be safe routes because they allowed greater maneuverability for a large army. The third and most direct route was through the Aruna Pass, also known as the Thutmose Pass. It led to a plain directly in front of the city of Megiddo. The danger here, though, was that the pass was extremely narrow and more susceptible to an enemy ambush. Thutmose III met with his war council, most of whom suggested that he take one of the first two options, but not the third and most direct route, since it was clearly the more dangerous one. According to inscriptions that were later inscribed onto the walls of Thutmose's great temple at Karnak, the king's military advisors are recorded to have told him the following.
How will it be to go on this road which becomes narrow, when it is reported that the enemies are waiting out there and they are numerous? Will not horse go behind horse, and soldiers and people too? Will our vanguard be fighting, while our rear guard is waiting here in Aruna and unable to fight?
Their advice was clear. The army should not go through the Aruna Pass. But Thutmose rejected his council's advice, and according to the same inscription, told them,
I shall proceed on this Aruna road.
The reason for this is that Thutmose believed that the king of Kadesh and his Canaanite allies would come to the same conclusion as his war council and expect the Egyptians to take either the northern or southern route. 2 days later, Thutmose and his army left Yehem and marched to the Aruna Pass, where they set up camp for the night. Leaving early the next morning, the Egyptian army began their perilous march through the pass towards the city of Megiddo. The pass was so narrow, only 30 feet wide at some points, that the army's chariots and supplies often had to be unloaded and carried through the unforgiving terrain. Scholars estimate that at its longest stretch, the length of the line formed by the troops as they squeezed through the pass may have been 20 kilometers, with Thutmose III at its head. However, by nightfall, most of the troops had made it through without any real resistance. There was reportedly only a small detachment of Canaanite soldiers guarding the mouth of the pass, and this was easily dealt with. Setting up camp by the Kina Brook, Thutmose and his men rested for the night. Thutmose had been right. The king of Kadesh and his allies had not expected them to take the Aruna Pass, which gave the Egyptians the element of surprise. Early the next morning, the Egyptians crossed the Kina Brook and attacked Megiddo. Though we only have one account of the battle, that of Thutmose himself, we're told that the pharaoh personally led the attack that sliced through the Canaanite left flank, breaking up their lines and forcing many of them to retreat and flee for the safety of Megiddo's high defensive walls. The inscription at Karnak tells us that the Canaanites
saw his majesty prevailing over them, and they fled headlong to Megiddo with faces of fear. They abandoned their horses and their chariots of gold and silver.
The battle would have ended there and then in a decisive victory for the Egyptians had Thutmose's usually disciplined troops not given into temptation. Instead of pursuing the king of Kadesh and the remnants of the Canaanite army as they fled towards the gates of Megiddo, many of the Egyptians halted their pursuit in order to plunder the enemy's hastily abandoned camp. Among the spoils were fine horses, elaborately decorated chariots, gold, prisoners, and the grand tent of the king of Kadesh. This distraction bought time for what was left of the Canaanite army and allowed many enemy soldiers, including their officers, to pass through Megiddo's gates and hide behind the safety of the city's defensive walls. Those who couldn't make it before the gates were closed were pulled over the walls by the city's inhabitants, who created makeshift ropes out of twisted clothes. What could have been a resounding victory for Thutmose III soon turned into a long siege. After several months, Megiddo's inhabitants had all but run out of food, and in desperation, several of them came out to surrender. Thutmose pardoned them, and when word got to the other residents of Megiddo that the pharaoh would grant them amnesty if they put down their arms, the city soon surrendered. By then, though, many of the Canaanite kings, including the king of Kadesh, had escaped. However, Megiddo's fall had demonstrated to the world that the new pharaoh would not take any defiance lightly, nor was he an armchair general. This resulted in many other rebel Canaanite cities willfully coming back into the fold, or else risk the wrath of Egypt's new pharaoh. Monetarily, the campaign against the king of Kadesh had been a profitable one, and Thutmose's Karnak inscriptions also tell us that the spoils included a chariot made of gold belonging to the prince of Megiddo, 892 regular chariots, bronze armor, 502 bows, over 2,000 horses and colts, and at least 20,000 cattle. While the citizens of Megiddo were spared, many of the princes that evaded capture were sent to Egypt as hostages. Though for the next 20 years, Thutmose III would participate in at least another 16 military campaigns, the Egyptian victory at Megiddo was by far his most important triumph and marked the resurgence of Egyptian power in Western Asia. As Thutmose's stature grew, the rulers of the Hittites, Babylonians, and perhaps even those from Mycenaean Greece sent gifts containing gold, silver, and precious stones to the pharaoh. Thutmose's goal was not to simply terrorize local populations into submission, but to gain security for Egypt. He knew that if Egypt wanted to possess Canaan, Nubia, and other lands for the long term, then it would be important to invest into the cities, ports, and towns that he'd conquered, or reconquered, in order to help make them even more prosperous. Ultimately, this is what he did, showing his subjects that the Egyptians were not just passing through, but were there to stay, and integrate them into their growing empire for generations to come. The effects of Thutmose's campaigns were not just felt in the Levant, but all over Egypt. Many of the Egyptian soldiers who fought in the pharaoh's nearly annual campaigns returned home with foreign wives, as well as a taste for all things Eastern. Even Thutmose III may have had not one, but several foreign wives. Text on one Egyptian vessel, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, reads, "Given as a blessing of the king to the king's wife, Manuai." Other objects, such as bracelets and fine jewelry with similar inscriptions, were given to women named Manhata and Maruta. The names of these three women suggest that they were not of Egyptian origin, but from a place where a Semitic language, such as Canaanite or Akkadian, was spoken. They may have been the daughters of kings or chieftains from the east whom Thutmose had married as part of a peace deal. As powerful as Thutmose III was, he of course couldn't do everything on his own. While he may have been an absolute monarch in every sense, supporting him were a small but highly trusted and capable group of officials who ran the domestic affairs of the empire on his behalf, especially when he was away from the capital, expanding it. These included royal viziers, regional governors, important scribes, the chief priest of the temple of Amun, internal security chiefs, and the like. After a reign of technically 54 years as king, part of which he shared as co-ruler with Hatshepsut, Thutmose III passed away in 1425 BC. Due to all that he had accomplished during his reign, many Egyptologists have considered him to be one of, if not the greatest king, to ever have ruled over Egypt. Thutmose III's son and successor, Amenhotep II, followed in the footsteps of his father and continued most of his foreign and domestic policies, though he ruled for a much shorter period of time and didn't launch nearly as many foreign campaigns, which, as we'll soon see, may not have been necessary. Growing up mostly in the old capital of Memphis, the prince who would become Amenhotep II was not originally destined for the throne. In fact, it was his elder brother, Amenenhat, who was the original heir, but he predeceased his father, Thutmose III. Most Egyptologists identify Amenenhat's mother as Thutmose's great royal wife Satia, but she had also died in the 24th year of his reign. And so, the throne fell to another son of Thutmose III from his second wife, a commoner named Meriritre Hatshepsut, no relation to the famous Hatshepsut who ruled just a few decades before. To help shore up his succession, Amenhotep ruled as a junior co-regent with his father for 2 years before striking it out on his own at the age of 18. Soon afterward, he married a woman named Tia, who bore him at least 10 sons and several daughters, but for some reason was never given the title of Great Royal Wife. She also never appears in any of his inscriptions or in depictions with the king, which was extremely odd. In fact, the only reason we know about her is because her son, and Amenhotep II's successor, Thutmose IV, did mention and depict her in his monuments. No one knows the real reason for this, but that doesn't mean there aren't many theories as to why Amenhotep II never mentioned his queen. The most popular one is that though Amenhotep was the pharaoh and the most powerful person in Egypt, he still may have been a bit insecure, since his mother was a commoner and only the second wife of his father, not the great royal wife. Though Tia's parentage isn't known, it's been speculated that she may have been of a more noble birth than his mother, and so Amenhotep may have feared that one day she might overshadow and become more influential than him, as was the case with Hatshepsut and his father, Thutmose III. Despite efforts to erase her from history, the memory of Hatshepsut was still fresh in the minds of Egyptians, and Amenhotep II may have felt that it was better to keep his own consort, and even his daughters by his great royal wife, out of the public eye. Thutmose III had already done most of the hard work when it came to increasing stability and expanding the Egyptian empire, and so there was not much for Amenhotep II to do on that front. His main job would be to preserve all that his father had built. The transition period between one king to another was often seen as an opportunity for discontented subjects to test the mettle of the new ruler, and the early years of Amenhotep II's reign were no exception. One such challenge was a massive revolt in an area called Taxi, in what's today northern Syria. Here, Amenhotep II personally led his troops to victory, but the aftermath was especially bloody. We're told from his inscriptions that the bodies of 7 of Taxi's rebel leaders were hung from the masts of Amenhotep's flagship, 6 of whom, after arriving at Thebes, were hung up on the walls of the temple at Karnak. The 7th corpse was sent to the city of Napata in southern Nubia as a warning to would-be rebels there. But that wasn't all. Along with a staggering amount of Taxi's gold and horses, Amenhotep reportedly deported 90,000 prisoners of war, including thousands of entire families, though scholars have no way of verifying this. The message had been made crystal clear. Amenhotep would not tolerate any dissent to Egyptian authority in any of its territories. This hard-handed policy against any opposition was meant to be a warning to the Mitanni and other regional rivals of what would happen should they defy the pharaoh. If that was indeed the case, then the message had been received. For around the 9th year of Amenhotep II's reign, the Mitanni formally made peace with Egypt, and the two states officially established diplomatic relations. The peace seems to have held because afterward, there were no more Egyptian military campaigns in the Near East for decades to come. The same was true for Nubia, though that wasn't due to any sort of treaty, but more to the fact that most of its rebel leaders had either already been killed off or were too afraid to start any new trouble. The stability gained from peace allowed Amenhotep II to focus on new building projects throughout Egypt, as well as to complete work on older ones. Unlike his 18th dynasty predecessors, who had focused their efforts primarily around the family's ancestral home of Thebes, many of the buildings and monuments commissioned by Amenhotep were constructed around Memphis, and also various parts of Lower Egypt, including a new temple near the Great Sphinx. The area was frequented by Amenhotep as a young prince, and perhaps to commemorate the fact, he commissioned a relatively large stela on the northeastern side of the Sphinx, extolling his virtues as an archer and his fondness for horses. Parts of the inscription inscribed on it read,
"He drew his bow while holding 4 arrows together in his fist. Thus he rode northward, shooting at them, each arrow coming out at the back of its target while he attacked the next post. It was a deed never yet done, never yet heard reported, shooting an arrow at a target of copper so that it came out of it and dropped to the ground. Now when he was still a youth, he loved his horses and rejoiced in them. He was stout-hearted in working them, learning their natures, skilled in training them, and understanding their ways. When it was heard in the palace by his father, the Horus, strong bull arisen in Thebes, his majesty's heart was glad to hear it. Rejoicing at what was said of his eldest son, he said in his heart, 'You will make a ruler of the whole land whom no one can attack. He is eager to excel and rejoices in strength, while as yet a charming youth without wisdom. Though not yet at the age to do the work of Mont, he ignores the thirst of the body and loves strength. It is the god who inspires him to act, so as to become the protector of Egypt, the ruler of the land.'"
Though the Great Sphinx is believed by most Egyptologists to have been built by the 4th dynasty king, Khafre, whose face it supposedly depicts, by Amenhotep II's reign, well over 1,000 years later, it had come to be seen as one of the many manifestations of the sun god, Ra, specifically as Horemheb, meaning Horus of the horizon. At the time, Amenhotep II's construction of a relatively simple mud brick temple dedicated to the sun god may have seemed inconsequential. Amun was still the king of the gods in the Egyptian pantheon, and most of the new monumental temples that had been constructed throughout the country were built in his honor. But in retrospect, a great religious transformation may have been budding with the foundation of such a temple at a very significant and already ancient site, whose prominence rose to a whole new level during the reign of Amenhotep II's son and successor, Thutmose IV. Thutmose IV is one of the more controversial pharaohs of the 18th dynasty for several reasons, but most notably because many Egyptologists believe that he was a usurper. His elder brother had originally been designated as Amenhotep II's successor, but he either predeceased his father or, as many believe, was ousted by the one who became Thutmose IV. As evidence of the latter, several Egyptologists have cited passages from the so-called dream stela of Thutmose IV, which he purposely placed in between the paws of the Great Sphinx. Both father and son had a particular fondness for this monumental structure, but Thutmose IV went way beyond Amenhotep II with his reverence for the Sphinx. In the dream stela, Thutmose states that Horemheb was his personal guardian, and that the deity came to him in a dream when he was still a prince, and promised that he would become pharaoh if he removed the large deposits of sand that had accumulated up to the neck of the Great Sphinx over the centuries. The relevant passage from the dream stela goes as follows.
"One of those days, it so happened that Prince Thutmose came, passing by at the time of midday, and he sat down in the shadow of this great god. Sleep seized him, asleep at the time when the sun was at the zenith, and he found the majesty of this noble god speaking with his own mouth, like the words of a father for his son, saying,
Look at me. See me, my son Thutmose. I am your father, Horemheb III, and I shall give you the kingship on earth in front of all the living ones. You shall wear the white and the red crowns upon the throne of Geb, the hereditary prince. The earth shall be yours in its length and width, all that the eye of the Lord of all illuminates. The food of the two lands shall be yours, and the great tributes of every foreign land. Your lifetime will be a time great in years. My face is yours, my heart is yours, as you are a protector to me. For my present condition is like one that is in need. All my limbs are dismembered, as the sands of the desert upon which I lie have reached me. So run to me, to have that done which I desire, knowing that you are my son and my protector. Come forth, and I shall be with you. I shall be your leader.
Thutmose IV claims to have done as instructed, clearing away the sand and restoring the damaged parts of the Sphinx, and as his reward, he was made Pharaoh of Egypt. Of course, many Egyptologists don't buy it, and believe that the story was simply royal propaganda that had been concocted by Thutmose to cover up seizing the throne from his brother. But there may have been another reason as to why Thutmose may have commissioned this stela. Claiming Horemheb as his father and protector meant that he was not beholden to the almighty god Amun, and probably more importantly, his priesthood, which, by his reign, had become extremely influential in the politics of the country. In fact, Amun isn't even mentioned within the text of the Dream Stela, which in hindsight appears to have been a precursor to the religious revolution that was on the horizon. Whether truly legitimate or not, Thutmose IV's time on the throne was short, just 10 years. But his was a calm and prosperous reign, thanks to all that his predecessors had done to create a strong and stable state. With the exception of a few minor rebellions, there were no large-scale military campaigns recorded, and gold continued to flow from the mines of Nubia. The pharaoh's loyal military made sure to keep dissent amongst Egypt's subject territories and client kingdoms to a minimum. And so, Thutmose IV wasn't required to lead his troops into battle. The continued peace with the Mitanni also allowed for the free flow of gold and goods from the east. Copper, tin, wine, lapis lazuli, wood, textiles, and all sorts of exotic items from the east found their way into the markets of Memphis and Thebes. Like his forebearers, Thutmose IV also had his fair share of construction projects at Karnak and other places, one of these being the completion of what's today the world's tallest standing obelisk, which currently resides not in Egypt, but in Rome. Known today as the Lateran obelisk, it was started by Thutmose III, but finally completed during the reign of Thutmose IV. About 14 centuries later, the great obelisk was transported to Rome on the orders of Emperor Constantius II, where it's been ever since. Though his reign had been relatively short, Thutmose IV left behind for Amenhotep III, his son and successor, an Egyptian state that was the wealthiest and most powerful that it had ever been in history. It was an empire at peace with its neighbors. In fact, there is not one Egyptian military campaign recorded in Asia during Amenhotep III's entire reign of 38 years, and the brief uprisings that did occur in Nubia were quickly put down by the pharaoh's viceroy of Kush. Due to his father's short time on the throne, Amenhotep III was quite young when he became pharaoh, and it's possible that his mother, Mutemwiya, acted as regent until he came of age. As she was a commoner, there seems to have been no threat of her pulling a stunt like Hatshepsut and anointing herself as pharaoh. She seems to have had some influence, though, in choosing his first wife, a woman named Tie, who was from a noble family from the Nile Delta. She became Amenhotep III's great royal wife and bore him at least 2 sons and 4 daughters. Tie, though, was not his only wife. In addition to her, Amenhotep had several other wives and concubines, many of them being foreign princesses who were the result of diplomatic marriages. 2 of the best known of these were the Mitanni princesses, Gilukepa and Tadukepa, but there were also several others from Babylon, the Levant, and even the Arzawa region of Anatolia. As Amenhotep III ended up living for nearly 4 decades, the list of women who occupied the royal harem constantly expanded. In contrast to his dynastic ancestors, such as Ahmose, Thutmose I, and Thutmose III, Amenhotep III lived a relatively easy life. Though he would have had some mandatory military training, he had little, if any, real combat experience. Instead, he spent much of his time as a young pharaoh participating in various sports, such as hunting large animals. One scarab commemorating such a hunt reads as follows.
One came to His Majesty saying, "There are wild bulls in the desert in the region of Shetep." His Majesty sailed downstream, making good time, arriving in peace at the region of Shetep in the morning. His Majesty appeared in his chariot with his entire army behind him. Then His Majesty ordered a ditch to be dug to enclose these wild bulls, and His Majesty went forth against all these wild bulls. The number thereof 170 wild bulls. The number the king took in hunting on this first day, 56 wild bulls. His Majesty waited 4 days to give his horses a rest. His Majesty appeared in the chariot again. The number of wild bulls he took in hunting, 40 wild bulls. Total number of wild bulls killed, 96.
It was not necessarily the most challenging hunt, especially when the bulls were confined to a set area and he had his private army to assist him. But what else can one do to prove their skills as a warrior when there are literally no wars to be fought? Since the days of Narmer and the country's earliest known dynasties, Egypt's rulers had ventured east into the Sinai and Canaan, or south to Nubia, in order to obtain gold and the natural resources that their kingdoms needed to prosper. But by the reign of Amenhotep III, Egypt already controlled a vast empire that exceeded anything the kings of the Old and Middle Kingdoms could have ever imagined. There was now no need to fight wars for resources. Egypt had plenty of gold sailing downriver from Nubia, turquoise from mines in the Sinai, and good stone for building being quarried in all parts of the country. And its northern ports were also bringing in wealth from trade with the other civilizations of the Mediterranean and beyond. With the country's coffers overflowing with gold and silver, and its resource storehouses, as well as granaries filled to the brim, Amenhotep III probably decided that his legacy would not be as one of Egypt's greatest warriors, but its greatest builder. Amenhotep's long, stable, and peaceful reign, along with the staggering amounts of wealth that Egypt possessed, allowed him to fund construction and art projects on an unprecedented scale. In fact, no one, save for perhaps Ramesses II, who was pharaoh over a century later and reigned for 67 years, left behind more architectural wonders, though it should be noted that many of the works attributed to him were recycled, or perhaps a better term would be stolen, from Amenhotep III's own monuments. The skills of Egypt's architects, sculptors, painters, craftsmen, and jewelers all reached new heights of expertise during Amenhotep's reign. Due to the sheer size and number of the pharaoh's building campaigns, Amenhotep welcomed many artisans and laborers from abroad to come work in Egypt. All gods and goddesses were welcome too. While the earlier rulers of the dynasty had focused their devotion primarily on Amun, Amenhotep III, while not abandoning his dynasty's patron deity, was definitely fond of other immortal beings and sought their blessings by constructing temples for them. Some were dedicated to Khnum, while others to Ptah, but the deity to receive the most attention was the great ancient sun god, Ra, who was glorified and worshipped in several of his many manifestations, including Amun-Ra, his most popular form during the New Kingdom. Perhaps the most iconic set of monuments associated with Amenhotep III are what's known today as the Colossi of Memnon, on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. The name is a misnomer and comes from Greek and later Roman travelers who saw it and believed that these two colossal statues were representations of the Ethiopian king Memnon, who in Homer's epic, the Iliad, had fought alongside the Trojans at Troy. At about 60 feet high, these statues of Amenhotep III once guarded the entrance to the pharaoh's great mortuary temple, which covered over 93 acres, and was even larger than the main temple of Amun at Karnak. In the 11th year of his reign, Amenhotep started a palace at the site today known as Malkata. It wasn't complete until 18 years later, which was just in time for the extravagant Jubilee festivals dating to his 30th, 34th, and 37th year as king. Such jubilees were rare in Egyptian history, as only 1 in 8 rulers ever reached 30 years on the throne. The Malkata Palace also contained a special temple dedicated to Amenhotep's great royal wife, Tiye. By the 1370s BC, Amenhotep III had been living the good life for well over a decade, inaugurating new construction projects, dabbling in unorthodox religious ideas, and spending considerable time in his harem. He was the most powerful man in the Near East, with more wealth and manpower than any of his neighbors. And yet, tensions could easily flare up between the egotistical rulers of empires who were often more than willing to go to war for a simple perceived insult. As Amenhotep III was busy in Thebes with his domestic agenda, it was up to Egypt's skilled diplomats and statesmen to keep the peace in the ancient Near East, which they did by facilitating the exchange of ambassadors and lavish gifts on the pharaoh's behalf, specifically with his counterparts in the kingdom of the Mitanni, Babylon, and later on, the Hittite Empire. Much of what we know about Egypt's foreign relations from this time period comes from a cache of diplomatic correspondence that we today know as the Amarna letters. Discovered in 1887 at the site of Tel el Amarna, whose real significance we'll get to shortly, the Amarna letters are actually cuneiform tablets written in the Babylonian dialect of Akkadian, which was the lingua franca of the day. The contents of these documents tell of the relations between Egypt and its neighbors, including its vassals in Western Asia. The letters received from foreign heads of state show a degree of camaraderie that comes with being in an exclusive fraternity of near equals. Each ruler regularly referred to the other as my brother, and sent their good wishes and gifts. An example of one such greeting can be found in a letter from the Mitanni king Tushratta to Amenhotep III.
For you may all go well, for your household, for your wives, for your sons, for your nobles, for your warriors, for your horses, for your chariots, and in your country may all go very well.
Such pleasantries were usually a prelude to special requests or favors that the sender often expected to receive. Tushratta's letter then continues.
May my brother send me unworked gold in very great quantities, and much more gold than he sent to my father. In my brother's country, gold is as plentiful as dirt.
There was some truth to his words. for thanks to Egypt's solid control over the gold-producing regions of Nubia, Amenhotep had plenty of the precious metal to spare, and probably sent a decent amount to his so-called brother Tushratta, who at the time was facing pressure from rivals within the Mitanni nobility, as well as a resurgent Hittite empire to the north. What Amenhotep III and other pharaohs would not send to their foreign brothers were Egyptian women to be their wives. In one of his previous letters, the Babylonian king, Kadashman-Enlil, had requested Amenhotep III to send one of his daughters to him for marriage. After all, Amenhotep had a Babylonian princess in his harem, so why should he not return the favor to his Kassite comrade in Babylon? After the pharaoh sent a letter to him rebuffing his initial request and explaining that Egyptian princesses did not marry foreigners, a rather frustrated and insulted Kadashman-Enlil wrote yet again to Amenhotep with the same request and asked why he had still not sent anyone.
Moreover, you, my brother, when I wrote to you about marrying your daughter, you wrote to me saying, "Never has a daughter of the king of Egypt been given to anyone." Why is she not given? You are king. You do as you please. If you were to give her, who would say anything? When they told me this, I wrote to my brother thus, saying, "Surely beautiful women, adult daughters, are available. Send me one beautiful woman as if she were your daughter. Who would say she is not the king's daughter?" But you, in accord with your refusal, did not send me anyone. Did you not seek brotherhood and friendship when you wrote to me about marriage so that we might become close relations to each other? And I, myself, for this very same reason, for brotherhood and friendship, wrote to you about marriage in order that we might become close relations to each other. Why has my brother not sent me one woman?
As far as we know, Amenhotep refused Kadashman-Enlil's request. The pharaoh, though, is reported to have taken a second Babylonian wife, along with a princess from Arzawa. He at times also demanded women from his vassals as well. One letter to his Canaanite client king of the city of Gezer requested
40 female cupbearers, 40 shekels of silver being the price of a female cupbearer. Send extremely beautiful female cupbearers in whom there is no defect, so the king, your lord, will say to you, "This is excellent, in accordance with the order I gave you."
Around 1360 BC, his 30th year on the throne, Amenhotep III prepared for the age-old jubilee known as the Sed Festival, which not only reaffirmed an Egyptian king's rulership over the country, but was also meant to celebrate his life and rejuvenate his spirit. Sed festivals were very special, but also relatively rare occasions, as few kings ruled for 30 or more years. A long-reigning ruler in Egypt was also a sign of political stability and prosperity, and Amenhotep III's reign continued to have plenty of both. Unlike most members of his dynasty, who exalted and devoted themselves to the god Amun, Amenhotep III made no secret of his rather unusual fascination and personal connection with the sun god, Ra. He often referred to himself as Ra's chosen one, the heir of Ra, and the Eye of Ra. Many years before the Sed festival, he had personally ordered the construction of solar courts, also associated with Ra, at all of the major places of worship throughout Egypt and Nubia. But during his Sed festival, which lasted several months, Amenhotep may have taken things much further by possibly becoming the first Egyptian king to be deified during his lifetime. This is something that is not totally agreed upon by all Egyptologists, but those arguing in favor of it cite several aspects of the latter years of the king's reign. One is that he claimed to be the living Aten, which was a manifestation of the sun god Ra, represented by a solar disk or orb. Amenhotep not only associated himself with the Aten, but also used to refer to himself as the dazzling Aten. But greater proof of him becoming a living god during his lifetime is due to a ritual or reenactment that Amenhotep and his wife, Tie, partook in, where the king was united with the sun god, which, according to Egyptian belief, only happened after the ruler had already died. Egyptologist Toby Wilkinson describes how this may have occurred during the said festival.
On the morning of the main celebrations, the courtiers, high officials, royal acquaintances, and other dignitaries were ushered into the palace. There, the king showered them with gifts of gold necklaces, golden ornaments in the shapes of ducks and fish, and as a special jubilee decoration, ribbons of green linen. The guests shared in a great breakfast banquet with their sovereign before being directed to leave the palace and proceed to the artificial harbours. Then, in a spectacular set-piece display of royal power and divine kingship, Amenhotep III and Tai appeared at the waterside, decked from head to foot in gold, dazzling like the sun itself. At the eastern harbour, they boarded a replica of the sun god's morning bark. The waiting courtiers picked up the prow ropes and pulled the ship gently along, acting out the daily miracle by which the sun god was towed into the heavens at dawn. The scene then shifted to the western harbour, where king and consort appeared once again, but this time in a replica of the sun god's evening bark. Dignitaries grasped the tow ropes, and the scene was repeated, symbolizing the sun god's descent into the underworld at dusk.
The fact that Amenhotep identified so strongly with the sun god and the Aten, as well as carried out the reenactment of this post-death ritual while still alive, has been interpreted by many that the pharaoh had essentially deified himself by merging with the sun during his lifetime. As arguably the most powerful and definitely the richest man on earth, it's not hard to see that Amenhotep may have indeed thought he was already divine. Or it simply could have been for the entertainment for all of those in attendance. Amenhotep III was not one to spare any expense when it came to his own self-promotion, and so his several-month said festival, possibly the greatest party that the world up until then had ever seen, had to outdo any other event that had ever occurred in history. Amenhotep III would go on to celebrate a second jubilee during his 34th year on the throne, and another during his 37th. It's from documents related to Amenhotep's jubilees and other large projects that we've learned quite a bit about the people closest to him, both at court and in the field. Many of these people became extremely influential during the latter years of Amenhotep's reign. One of these was Amenhotep, son of Hapu, who, though he was never a royal vizier, was one of the pharaoh's most trusted men. An older government official who had served in past administrations as a scribe, priest, and eventually an architect, Amenhotep, son of Hapu's many important tasks included quarrying and transporting the stone used in the construction of some of the pharaoh's most monumental and iconic structures, including the so-called Colossi of Memnon. This extremely prestigious position paved the way for him to play a more prominent role in the said festival, as well as become the chief steward for the pharaoh's daughter, Princess Sitamun. When he died at the age of 80 during Amenhotep's 34th regnal year, the pharaoh had a mortuary temple built for him near his own, and created an endowment for its upkeep that was still functioning over 3 centuries later. Other officials were also honored with lavish tombs, most of them in and around Thebes, but some also around the great necropolis of Saqqara, near the step pyramid of King Djoser. As for Amenhotep III, he died in 1352 BC, just a year after his third said festival. His cause of death isn't known, but he was in his late 40s when he took his last breath, and his body was soon laid to rest in the Valley of the Kings near the remains of his ancestors. As we've seen, Amenhotep III had many wives and concubines, so it's no surprise that he also had many children, not all of whom are known to us. The one who initially became his crown prince was named Thutmose, who was his eldest son from his great royal wife, Ta. However, in the 30th year of Amenhotep's reign, around the same time as he was celebrating his first Sed festival, Thutmose unexpectedly died, and his younger brother, also named Amenhotep like his father, became the new crown prince, and possibly junior co-ruler. When Amenhotep III died 8 years later, his son and successor became Amenhotep IV. Very little is known about Amenhotep IV before he became king. Some Egyptologists believe that he was born in Thebes, while others contend that his birthplace was Memphis. The woman who would become Amenhotep IV's great royal wife was Nefertiti, whose name means, "A beautiful woman has come." Due to this, some have speculated that she may have been a foreign princess, but there's no strong evidence for this. It's likely that she came from a noble, though non-royal family. Some have even theorized that her father may have been the aged royal vizier, I, who eventually went on to become Pharaoh himself, but more on that later. Though Amenhotep IV would eventually take other wives, surviving texts, inscriptions, and especially artwork indicate that he and Nefertiti had an extremely close relationship. She would give him 6 daughters, but no sons. Initially, Amenhotep IV followed in the footsteps of his father by commissioning new, monumental buildings in Thebes and the great temple complex at Karnak. Outside of that temple's eastern walls, so that it could face the sunrise, Amenhotep started the construction of a new sanctuary dedicated to the Aten, which, as mentioned earlier, was an aspect of the sun god Ra and represented by a solar disk or an orb. By his grandfather Thutmose IV's time, but probably also before that, the Aten was worshipped as if it were itself an independent deity. The largest temple within this new sanctuary was the Gempa Aten, meaning the Aten is found. It was a roofless building with an offering table towards its center that was directly exposed to the rising sun. Whether Amenhotep IV had thought to build such a grand temple on his own, or was simply continuing a project devised by his father, isn't known, but the sanctuary became his crowning achievement at Karnak. Amun's status as the patron god of the pharaoh and his family drastically changed during the reign of Amenhotep III, who clearly associated himself with and worshipped the Aten. However, even after he supposedly deified himself, Amenhotep III still acknowledged and maintained the sanctuaries of the other gods within Egypt's vast pantheon. His son and successor, Amenhotep IV, would go much further and very clearly promote the worship of the Aten above all others. By the 3rd year of his reign, the new king had already celebrated at least one Sed festival dedicated to the Aten. Some have speculated that this may have been to honor his own father, Amenhotep III, the dazzling Aten, who was now a god. Perhaps, but what is known is that from roughly that point onward, Amenhotep IV focused his worship primarily, if not entirely, on the Aten, and treated it like some heavenly pharaoh with its own royal names and cartouches. Going forward, we'll refer to the cult centered around the Aten as Atenism. The most radical changes, though, were still to come. During the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV officially changed his name to Akhenaten, which can be translated in different ways, including servant of the Aten or beneficial to the Aten. Nefertiti also added the title Neferneferu Aten before her name, which according to one scholar translates as, "The most perfect is the Aten." In addition, the Aten would no longer appear atop the head of a falcon, as had generally been the case in popular depictions, but was now represented as a simple solar orb whose rays ended with human hands. Religious makeovers aside, Amenhotep IV, now Akhenaten, had inherited a stable, extremely prosperous, and highly bureaucratic state with a formidable military that had, up until then, enabled Egypt to keep its position as the wealthiest and most powerful nation in the ancient world at that time. This was of course due to the reforms and innovations, not to mention the sheer tenacity of his ancestors such as Thutmose I, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and even his own father, Amenhotep III, under whose reign Egypt had arguably reached the pinnacle of its civilization. They had all done their part to bequeath to Akhenaten an empire that ran like a well-oiled machine, and that possessed seemingly unlimited resources at its disposal. Thus, Akhenaten could more or less rule as he liked. But there was one being, and specifically one institution, blocking Akhenaten from building his Aten-centered utopia: Amun and his powerful priesthood. Ever since the days of Ahmose I, when the cult of Amun had become the national one, royal patronage of its temples and priesthood had made it the most important and prestigious religious organization in the country. Over the past 2 centuries, the religious establishment devoted to Amun had become extremely wealthy and influential in Egyptian politics. They also benefited tremendously from their strong ties to the country's more conservative elites, and combined, these two forces could even rival the absolute power of the pharaoh. Akhenaten must have known that he would encounter stiff resistance against his religious radicalism, and so he decided to build a new capital city that was far away from the priesthood and those from the Egyptian nobility who might oppose him. Such a city would also be away from the colossal temple of Amun and any other religious institution that could interfere with the worship of the Aten. The site he chose for it was up until then an unused part of the eastern bank of the Nile, roughly equidistant from Egypt's 2 historical power centers of Memphis and Thebes. He called it Akhenaten, meaning the horizon of the Aten. In an inscription, Akhenaten stated that he took advice from the Aten with regard to its construction.
Setting out on the good road to Akhenaten on the first anniversary of visiting it, which His Majesty had done so as to found it as a monument to the Aten, according to the command of his father, Rib-Hadda, who rejoices in light land, who gives life forever, to make for him a monument in its midst.
Today, most people refer to the site by its local Arabic name, Tel el-Amarna, or simply Amarna. The name also refers to the span of time that included the reigns of Akhenaten and his short-lived successors, which we call the Amarna period. Building cities in any age required natural resources, manpower, and time. The first 2 Akhenaten had in abundance. Time, though, was limited, and so the pharaoh's architects and builders avoided the use of massive blocks of stone, which were both more expensive and extremely difficult to transport. Instead, they used much smaller blocks and mud bricks that weighed on average 50 kilograms. Known today as talatats, the bricks were easy to handle and could be assembled in various layouts rather quickly. After a building or even a wall had been erected, reliefs were often carved onto the bricks, which were then painted in bright colors. The use of such blocks allowed for the construction of a functioning city in just 2 years. The most important building was the House of the Aten, which was a great, roofless temple dedicated to the Aten that stood at the heart of the city. Inside, there were no idols, just a large courtyard at the center with an open altar for offerings. Nearby were administrative buildings where the king's top government officials and advisors worked. The royal family's palace complex was located at the northwestern part between the Nile and the surrounding cliffs that protected the city. Not too far away were large mansions where the pharaoh's most trusted advisors lived. The city also had beautiful gardens that were irrigated by a network of canals. Just south of the city was land used for farming and cattle grazing. Running through Akhenaten was what some have called the Royal Road. Surrounded by his guards, Akhenaten would ride every day on his golden chariot from the royal palace to the house of the Aten, as well as the nearby government buildings where he would first worship and then work. Akhenaten was just as much a religious center as it was the political and administrative capital of Akhenaten's New Egypt. Buildings, temples, and monuments in Akhenaten were decorated and embellished with a particularly new and unique style of art said to have been devised by Akhenaten himself. The art of the period was innovative for its day, in that it combined a sort of realism with distorted facial and bodily features. For example, there were many scenes that depicted daily life in vivid detail, including a level of intimacy between the king, his wife, and their children that had never before been seen in Egyptian art. At the same time, they are portrayed with elongated faces, stretched necks, thick lips, unusually wide hips, and bulging bellies that make one wonder if they all had some sort of deformity or disease. The vast majority of Egyptologists, though, have ruled this out. More than likely, such art was intended to highlight Akhenaten and his family's otherworldliness and special place in the universe due to being the earthly representatives of the Aten. Visual arts were not the only way to convey Atenism. The ideas of the religion and the royal family's role within it could be communicated through poetry. One of the greatest works of Egyptian literature ever to come out of the New Kingdom era is what's known as the Great Hymn to the Aten. It tells of how the sun god created the world and watches everything within it. Excerpts from the hymn read as follows.
Splendid you rise in heaven's lightland, O living Aten, creator of life. When you have dawned in eastern lightland, you fill every land with your beauty. You are beauteous, great, radiant, high over every land. Your rays embrace the lands to the limit of all that you made. Being Ra, you reach their limits, you bend them for the sun whom you love. Though you are far, your rays are on earth. Though one sees you, your strides are unseen. Earth brightens when you dawn in lightland, when you shine as Aten of daytime. As you dispel the dark, as you cast your rays, the two lands are in festivity. Awake they stand on their feet, you have roused them, bodies cleansed, clothed. Their arms adore your appearance. The entire land sets out to work, all beasts browse on their herbs.
Many scholars of religion have made comparisons between the Great Hymn to the Aten and Psalm 104 of the Hebrew Bible. Whether Akhenaten, Nefertiti, or someone else composed the hymn is unknown, but the text does break with tradition in that it's written in the vernacular of the day, and not the standard Middle Egyptian that was generally used for literary works. Though on the surface everything may have seemed joyful and bright, the city of Akhenaten had a dark side. The rush to build the city from scratch in honor of a god took its toll on the workers involved in its construction. The common people who lived and worked in Akhenaten's new city of light lived extremely difficult and rather short lives. Autopsies on the remains of workers found in nearby shallow graves indicate that most died in their late teens, with very few living until the age of 40. Further analysis showed that most were malnourished due to their poor diets, and many were physically stunted from doing hard labor. The supposed paradise of Akhenaten that they'd been brought over to build was in reality a labor camp from which countless people never left alive. As the years went by, Akhenaten and the doctrines of Atenism became more extreme. The faith went from the Aten being the greatest of the gods to being the only god permitted to be worshipped. Akhenaten ordered his followers to erase the names of other deities, with the exception of the Aten and Ra, from all monuments and temples across Egypt. This, of course, was much easier said than done, and as we can still see today, there are countless monuments and old temples predating Akhenaten with the names of other deities in their inscriptions that are still very much intact. The pharaoh's edict, though, did make one thing clear. The worship of any other deity, especially Amun, was now officially banned. This has brought up a fierce debate amongst scholars as to whether or not Atenism was a true monotheism, meaning a religion that believed solely in the existence of only one god, or a monolatry, where devotees worshipped only one god but believed in the existence of others. Many Egyptologists, scholars of religion, and even philosophers state that Akhenaten's zealous worship of only the Aten, efforts to rid Egypt of the influence of other deities, and persecution of all other Egyptian cults is all clear evidence that Atenism eventually did become a monotheistic religion in the Abrahamic understanding of the term. However, there are those who make the case that Atenism didn't necessarily deny the existence of other deities, besides the Aten, but rather just held them in contempt. This would then make Atenism a monolatry, where its followers believed that the Aten was the supreme and most powerful, or correct god, but not necessarily the only god. Another interesting question is how many people in Egypt actually gave up their old traditional religion for Atenism. According to Egyptologists, not that many. Other than Akhenaten and the royal family, it seems that the only real adherents of Atenism were the elites who followed their pharaoh to Akhenaten. A good number of these may have only been paying lip service to the new religion in order to win the king's favor and advance their own political careers, or at least keep the one they had. The priesthood of Amun and supporters of the old religious establishment were the biggest losers in the new regime, since they were all, effectively, out of a job. However, the archaeological record indicates that many of the common people, even the workers at Akhenaten, still clung to their own popular religion and rituals. In fact, other than closing or repurposing some of the temples, life went on as usual for most Egyptians. While some kept their religious practices a secret and even changed their names, the lives of most, especially in rural areas, changed little, if at all. Farmers went on farming, weavers continued to weave, fishermen fished in the Nile, and government officials continued to run the state as they'd always done before. Since Akhenaten spent most, if not all of his time after the first half of his reign in Akhenaten, few outside of the capital ever saw or heard from their king. Akhenaten's obsession with the Aten, as well as his role as prophet and priest of his new state religion, diverted much of his attention from governing the empire at a time when it was facing new threats in a rapidly changing geopolitical environment. By the second half of Akhenaten's reign, the balance of power had shifted in the Near East to favor a resurgent Hittite empire under their great king, Shupilluliuma, whose home base was in central Anatolia. A cunning warrior as well as shrewd statesman, Shupilluliuma took advantage of divisions within the Mitanni ruling elite to play one side against the other, and then seize territory in the Levant, edging him ever closer towards Egypt's sphere of influence. But that wasn't all, as there were also threats to stability from within the Egyptian empire's borders. in perhaps as many as 50 letters addressed directly to Akhenaten or his vizier, Rib-Hadda, the vassal ruler of the strategic port of Byblos, implored the pharaoh to send him military aid in order to ward off threats to his city from nearby rivals. These included the warlord Abdi-Ashurta and his son, Aziru, who ruled over the border region of Amuru that was at least officially a protectorate of Egypt. Part of one of Rib-Hadda's many letters to Akhenaten, stressing the urgency of the situation, reads as follows.
May the king, my lord, be apprised that the city of Byblos, the faithful handmaiden of the king, has been at peace since the days of his fathers. But now the king has forsaken his loyal city. May the king examine the tablets of his father's palace whether the man who is in Byblos has not been a loyal servant. Do not be silent concerning your servant, since great is the hostility of the Apiru troops against him, and as the gods of your land live, used up are our sons and our daughters, and the wood of our houses for payment to the land of Yarimuta to preserve our lives.
Several of Rib-Hadda's other letters also illustrate Akhenaten and his government's apparent neglect of Egypt's Canaanite possessions.
Now, thus I have written to the palace, but you do not return a word to me. Was it not, in the past, regarding all the lands of the king, that yearly the regular troops were coming forth to inspect the lands? But now the lands of the king and the city of Sumur, your garrison city, have gone over to the Apiru men, and you keep silent. Send a large regular army and you can drive out the enemies of the king from within his land, and all the lands will be joined to the king. Furthermore, you are the great lord. You must not ignore this message. Why do you not send back word to me, so that I may know the thing that I should do? Furthermore, I have been writing for garrison troops and for horses, but they are not being given. Just send me the word, and I myself will make a treaty with Abdi-Ashurta, like Yapa-Hadi and Zimreda, and I will stay alive.
There are many such letters from Rib-Hadda, but in the end, he received no support from his king, and was eventually ousted from his post, and possibly killed in Sidon by men loyal to Aziru of Amuru. Many of the more capable statesmen and bureaucrats who were running the government must have realized that the status quo couldn't go on for much longer. Those well-versed in their country's most recent history knew that previous pharaohs, such as Thutmose III, who were devoted to Amun and the old gods, would not have let such a plea for help from a loyal vassal go unanswered. If anything, they would have personally led a grand army to deal with the transgressors and restore order. Akhenaten's religious revolution was becoming a big problem that, if left unchecked, could lead to not only the destruction of the Egyptian empire and a breakdown of the state, but even the end of Egyptian civilization as it had existed for nearly 2 millennia. But it was not easy to overthrow a pharaoh, especially one as powerful as Akhenaten. Surrounded by bodyguards, sycophants, and loyalists, Akhenaten's self-isolation in the city of the Aten protected him somewhat from a coup, and as far as we know, the army was still not only behind him, but also enforcing many of his edicts to promote Atenism throughout the country. The last 5 years of Akhenaten's life are full of intrigue and mystery. Very little written evidence survives from that time, but it's believed that he may have had problems stemming from poor health and the lack of a male successor. Nefertiti had given Akhenaten 6 daughters, but no sons, and after the pharaoh's 12th regnal year, she essentially disappears from the historical record. Or perhaps not. Soon after her disappearance, Akhenaten ruled with a co-regent named Semen-Kakare, who most scholars believe was married to his daughter, Mariaten, though he died within a year. Afterwards, a person named Neferneferuaten is believed to have become his co-regent. Recall that this was the name that Nefertiti had simultaneously adopted when Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten. Because of this, many Egyptologists have come to the conclusion that this particular Neferneferuaten was none other than the pharaoh's beloved wife, Nefertiti. Others have speculated that Neferneferuaten may have been Akhenaten's daughter, Mariaten, who again was believed to be the wife of Smenkhkare. The basic facts regarding these years are very sketchy, in large part due to the pharaohs after Akhenaten doing all that they could to destroy his legacy and essentially erase him from history. Akhenaten died in 1336 BC, the 17th year of his reign. Though he wished to be buried in a special tomb just outside of Akhetaten, a mummy believed to be his was uncovered in the Valley of the Kings, specifically Tomb KV 55. Though its identity could not be determined from the evidence found within the tomb, DNA analysis conducted in 2010 indicated that the mummy contained the remains of a man who was the son of Amenhotep III and the father of Egypt's most recognizable pharaoh in modern times, Tutankhamun. This has led many Egyptologists today to conclude that the mummified remains from Tomb KV55 are indeed those of Akhenaten. As there are more questions than answers with regard to the final years of Akhenaten's reign and its immediate aftermath, a great number of Egyptologists have put the start date of Tutankhamun's reign at 1336 BC, which may have overlapped with Neferneferuaten's reign or possible regency. Known by many today as the Boy King, Tutankhamun was only 9 years old when he became pharaoh. His original name was Tutankhaten, meaning the living image of the Aten. The exact identity of his mother isn't clear, but a mummy found in tomb KV35 was identified through DNA testing as being both the mother of Tutankhamun and the daughter of Amenhotep III and his wife, Tiye, which would also make her the sister of Akhenaten. As her real name isn't known, archaeologists refer to her as the Younger Lady. Tutankhamun's wife, who was also his half-sister, was called Ankesen Pa'aten, meaning she who lives for the Aten. She was the third of the 6 daughters born to Akhenaten and Nefertiti. The young Tutankhaten proved to be a godsend for those who wished to steer Egypt back to its traditional polytheistic religion. Not only did he have the right bloodline, but the boy king was also impressionable, and with his father dead, and most likely his mother too, Tutankhaten had few, if any, close elder relatives upon whom he could rely on for the guidance that he needed to rule. While Neferneferuaten may or may not have acted as regent during his early years, the one who ultimately stepped into this role was I, a man who at Tutankhaten's coronation may have already been in his late 60s. At the urging of I and other advisors, Tutankhaten changed his name to Tutankhamun, meaning the living image of Amun, while his wife, Ankesen Pa'aten, became Ankesen Amun, or she who lives for Amun. Soon, the new pharaoh left Akhetaten and went to the old capital of Memphis, where he issued a decree that re-established Egypt's traditional polytheistic religion and declared his devotion to Amun.
When His Majesty appeared as king, the temples and the cities of the gods and goddesses, starting from Elephantine and down to the delta marshes, had fallen into decay, and their shrines were in ruin, becoming mounds of rubble, overgrown with weeds. Their sanctuaries were like something that had not existed, and their temples were a footpath, for the land was wrecked and ruined. But after time passed, His Majesty appeared upon the throne of his father, and he ruled over the shores of Horus. The black land and the red land were under his supervision, and every land was bowing to his might. Then His Majesty took counsel with his heart, investigating every excellent deed, seeking benefactions for his father, the god Amun, and fashioning his noble image out of genuine electrum. He gave more than had given before. He fashioned an image of his father, the god Amun, his sacred image being of electrum, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and every precious stone.
Tutankhamun's reign seems to have gotten off to a good start. However, the young pharaoh was plagued with many health problems that may have included sickle cell anemia and also suffering from severe bouts of malaria. A CT scan of Tutankhamun's mummy also showed that the king had a compound fracture in his left leg, which may have come from a fall, and complications from this may have led to an early death at the age of just 19. The discovery of Tutankhamun's small but lavish tomb in the Valley of the Kings in 1922 by Howard Carter is perhaps the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. This is because it's perhaps the only tomb of a pharaoh ever to have been uncovered that also managed to escape looting by grave robbers. What was left behind was a whole host of funerary objects that included gold jewelry, chariots, furniture, cups and utensils made out of precious metals and stones, statues, fine clothing, textiles, at least 100 pairs of sandals, including some made of gold, walking canes, lots of artwork, musical instruments such as trumpets, ornate jars, and of course, his elaborate sarcophagus consisting of 3 coffins, the innermost being made of solid gold. Within this was the king's iconic gold funeral mask and his mummy, which, due to its poor condition, shows that the embalming process had been hastily done. Altogether, over 5,000 different objects were uncovered from his burial chamber, which makes one wonder that if so much were found in Tutankhamun's relatively small tomb, then what treasures must have been in the burial places of other, more powerful and significant kings. Since the boy king had left no heir, the untimely death of Tutankhamun created a major problem with regard to his successor. The 2 most influential people at the time, the Vizier I and Horemheb, the supreme commander of the armed forces, were also the 2 greatest contenders for the throne of Egypt. As Horemheb was likely with the army in the Levant fending off Hittite attacks, the aged I took advantage of his absence and crowned himself to be the next pharaoh. Some have speculated that he may have been chosen to succeed Tutankhamun because he was the father of Nefertiti, but this has never been proven. Other evidence seems to point to the notion that Tutankhamun had designated Horemheb to be his successor, but as he was away tending to military matters, like a vulture, I swooped in and grabbed the throne. That, or he himself might have had Tutankhamun killed while Horemheb was away. The theories of what happened immediately after Tutankhamun's death are many, but also inconclusive. I, though, didn't have the right bloodline, and so to make his claim to the throne more legitimate, he may have married Tutankhamun's widow, Akhenaten, who at the time was also perhaps the last surviving descendant of Akhenaten, Amenhotep III, and the whole Thutmosian line of pharaohs. The main evidence for such an arrangement comes from a series of letters that the Hittite king, Shupilluliuma, apparently received from an unnamed Egyptian queen with the bizarre request of asking him for one of his sons to marry. Shupilluliuma's successor, Mushili II, would later recount the story.
When my father was done in the country of Kharkhamish, he sent Lupaki and Tarkhunt Zalma into the country of Amka. And when the people of Egypt heard about the attack on Amka, they were frightened. And since, besides, their lord Nibkhururiya had died, the queen of Egypt sent a messenger to my father with this message: "My husband has died. I have no sons. They say that you have many sons. If you were to give me one of your sons, he would become my husband. I will never take a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am afraid."
It was an extremely odd request, but it aligns well with the known facts. Nib-Kururiya is the cuneiform rendition of Neb-Keperura, the throne name of Tutankhamun, who also died without an heir. His widow, Akhenaten, who at the time was in her 20s, would have also loathed to be forced to marry an aged commoner such as I, a man over 3 times her age, and in this case would have probably preferred the prince of a rival nation. In the end, we know that nothing became of the proposed Egyptian-Hittite union because Murshili II tells us that when one of Shupilluliuma's sons was finally sent, he died along the way to Egypt, possibly killed by the agents of Ai or other xenophobic Egyptians who would not have approved of a foreign prince becoming the new ruler of the Egyptian empire. We also don't have any real evidence that Akhenaten married Ai. At just 4 years, Ai's reign was very short, and in his tomb, which originally may have been for Tutankhamun, he's depicted with his only known wife, Te. There's no depiction, or even a mention of Akhenaten. After the death of Ai, General Horemheb, also a commoner, succeeded him. Not a fan of his predecessor, who he may have believed stole the kingship from him while he was away, Horemheb removed Ai's name from all public monuments, and then did the same for Akhenaten and Tutankhamun, basically putting the final nail in the coffin of the Amarna era. In the king list that would follow, the pharaohs from Akhenaten to Ai were never mentioned. The line went straight from Amenhotep III to Horemheb. Being a soldier at heart, Horemheb felt that the decadence and excess of Akhenaten's reign, not to mention his repudiation of the country's traditional gods and religion, had made Egypt weak. And so, he took firm measures to re-establish what he thought was law and order, as well as to reinstate, or at least reorganize, many of the country's institutions that had suffered during the past 2 decades. Horemheb was extremely distrustful of the old nobility, especially those who had followed Akhenaten, and he used whatever means at his disposal to curb their power. The temples that had been neglected during the Amarna period were refurbished and repopulated with priests loyal to both the old gods and to himself. The houses of worship built by Akhenaten and staffed by Atenes were torn down or repurposed. He also sent workers to Akhenaten to erase all traces of the heretic king and his wife, Nefertiti. Their statues were smashed and tossed into a heap of rubble near what had once been the great temple known as the House of the Aten. Horemheb then focused on weeding out corruption that had been rampant at all levels of Egyptian society. In an inscription from Karnak that has come to be known as the Great Edict of Horemheb, we're told that he at least claimed to do the following.
His Majesty took counsel with his heart how he might expel evil and suppress lying. The plans of His Majesty were an excellent refuge, repelling violence, and delivering the Egyptians from the oppressions which were among them. Behold, His Majesty spent the whole time seeking the welfare of Egypt and searching out instances of oppression in the land.
Of the document's 10 clauses, 4 of them specifically deal with punishments for corrupt government and palace officials, which, depending on the offense, could include anything from exile to facial mutilation, such as cutting off one's nose. To enforce his laws were new judges that Horemheb approved himself. They too were not above the law, for if found guilty of corruption themselves, they could be sentenced to death. Horemheb presented himself as a champion of the poor, and since he himself came from a modest background, many viewed him to be one. However, others saw his stuffing the courts and temples with loyalists as just another one of his tactics to consolidate more power for himself. But he was a hero for traditionalists, because by the end of Horemheb's reign in 1295 BC, Atenism had been completely purged from the corridors of power and replaced by the priests of Amun, who were now free to proclaim their god's greatness. Perhaps the only thing of importance that Horemheb had failed to procure during his 28-year reign was a son to be his heir. And so, Horemheb selected one of his generals named Paramisu to follow him as pharaoh upon his death. Paramisu is better known to us today by the name Ramesses, and having already a son and a grandson, he would go on to start a new line of kings that we today refer to as the 19th Dynasty of Egypt. But the start of a new dynasty was not the end of the new kingdom. Far from it. In fact, some of its best years and most celebrated rulers were yet to come. We'll learn more about all this in the next installment of Ancient Egypt, Dynasty by Dynasty. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. I'd like to thank both Danny Hussein and Irina of the Ancient Sites Girl channel for reading the quotes and bringing many of these characters to life. Check out Irina's channel to explore many of ancient Egypt's historical sites, especially the ones that most tourists never visit. And of course, I'd like to really thank the channel's patrons, including GrandKeg69, Yap de Graaf, Pasta Frola, Michael Lewis, Daniel Allen, Denny Van Eck, Lennox TV, Robert Morgan, Frank, Tim Lane, Sebastian Hurtado Correa, Michael Trudell, Leader Titan, Micah G, John Scarberry, Andrew Bomer, Monty Grimes, Franz Robbins, Cyrus Mir, Dianastra, Nimrod Nir, Brendan Redman, Faridun Dadachanji, Jimmy Daruwala, Anahita Debu, Gulistan Debu, Sher Kam, Farhad Kama, and all of the channel's patrons on Patreon for helping to support this and all future content. Check out the benefits to being a Patreon member, and if you'd like to join, feel free to click the link in the video description. You can also follow History with Sai on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, as well as continue to listen to special audio programs on the History with Sai podcast. Thanks again, and stay safe.